We turn to John chapter 11 this morning. Without a doubt, the climax of John's gospel. We'll be in the whole chapter, but I'll just read verse number 6. Keep your Bibles open, though, because we'll be looking at quite a few other verses. Verse 6 says, though, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he, talking about Jesus, stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Barbara Brown Taylor writes, the lights were dimly on when I walked into the room. There were 20 or 30 people gathered in the room, gathered in a lumpy circle around someone I could not clearly see. As the circle parted slightly to allow me to join, I saw a young mother sitting in a rocking chair, holding a bundle beside her, and there was a young father. In the circle were grandmas and grandpas and cousins and best friends and sisters and brothers who'd come to see the baby, to tell him goodbye. The room in which our stories were converging was on the pediatric intensive care unit at the local children's hospital. And the baby, Mark, well, he was dying. And Barbara says that I was the chaplain on duty that night. Everything that could be done for the 4-month-old baby Mark had been done, and yet his decline continued. His young parents, just 18 and 19, had done what many parents do. They had decided to release him from ongoing medical interventions that were preventing painfully the imminent and inevitable. And she writes, so here I was at 2:30 in the morning, an intern, the rookie, the chaplain present to love and walk these people through this valley. The mother was gently rocking. Her tears were spilling onto the tiny race car blanket. Dad stood by, shuffling from foot to foot. And Barbara says, I tried my best to find something, some words to help console this family. But let's be honest, there are no words. There are no words to say to someone going through something like that. As the mother's tears streamed down her face, she said, we have prayed, and we have prayed. But I just don't think God's listening. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been there when you were walking through the darkest valley of your life? And you had prayed till you couldn't pray anymore, and you had cried till you had no more tears left, and no matter what you did, no matter how many scripture verses you read, no matter how many people you called to ask pray for you, it seemed like God was not there. What do you do when you're going through the trial of your life and Jesus doesn't show up? If anybody knew what that felt like, it was two sisters in the town of Bethany. Jesus loved the town of Bethany. Seemed like every time he could, he went there. And I'm even uncomfortable calling Mary and Martha Jesus' friends, because they were more than friends. They may not have been blood relations, but despite that, they were still family. I think whenever Jesus was in the area, he stayed at their house. Martha would cook the meals. Mary would be the one to entertain. or to listen most of the time, I think. And more than anything, Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus loved Jesus. And I think they thought, if ever we need anything, he'll be there. All we've got to do is call and he'll be there. So then it happened. Lazarus gets sick. We don't know exactly what happened to him. All we're told is he gets sick. What did those two sisters do? They took their problem to Jesus. Not a bad thing to do. But this is the thing that has boggled the minds of scholars ever since the story's been written. They send the word to Jesus that Lazarus is sick. Now, Jesus was having some problems at this time, okay? The Jews were not happy with him. They had even tried to stone him. So Jesus has crossed over the Jordan River, and he's went about 20 miles from Bethany. 20 miles is no big deal today. We travel farther just to have dinner. 20 miles in this day was a big deal. It was a day's journey. So they send a messenger to Jesus. Jesus gets the message. Lazarus is sick. And the text says that he waits 2 more days before he does anything. It's so uncharacteristic. Jesus gets a message that somebody he loves is hurting. And he doesn't do anything. He didn't do anything even though he was called. He can't say he didn't know about it. He did. He was God. He knew about it anyway. But he specifically got the message. And I think we're not told what the messenger thought. But I really think this messenger had thought Jesus was going to say, okay, I'm right behind you, let's go. I'd love to see the look on that messenger's face when he hands Jesus the message or he tells Jesus what's going on. And we don't know what Jesus said. Maybe Jesus said, okay, thank you for letting me know. And the messenger's standing there waiting for Jesus to say, I'm coming. And Jesus doesn't say that. So the messenger walks on back to Bethany by himself. He didn't go, even though he was called. He didn't even go, even though he was concerned. I want you to look at verse 5. Accordingly, though, Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. I love the way that verse reads. Jesus loved Martha and her sister. Now we know that's Mary. John knows it's Mary. Why didn't he say Mary? I don't know. It's almost like the verse reads, and Jesus loved Martha and what's her name? And Lazarus. I love that Martha was put first, though. Because, I've read books, so many books, where Mary is just the portrait of a great disciple. And I've heard songs, I've sang songs, where it talks about Mary worshiping Jesus. I've heard sermons where Mary was just uplifted as a great worshiper. I've never heard a good sermon about Martha. I have never read a good chapter in any book about Martha. I have never sang or even heard a song that put Martha in a good light. And we all know about Martha. Martha was the one who did the cooking and the cleaning, and Martha did the work, and thank God for the Marthas of the world. But Martha was the type of a woman, and we all know some Marthas. When you said yes to Martha, you said yes, ma'am, to Martha. And when Martha asked you to do something, you did it. That was the type of person Martha was. She even one time told Jesus what to do, remember? She's in the kitchen with the pots and the pans and the meal getting ready, and Mary's in there just listening to Jesus teach, and Martha comes and says, Mary, I need some help. And Mary just keeps on listening to Jesus. And Martha peeps in again, and there Mary sits. And finally Martha has had it, and she says, Jesus, tell her to get up and help me. Now it's a little bit bold to be telling Jesus what to do, but that's the type of a woman Martha was. And I'm glad John puts Martha first in that verse, because I know there have been times I've told God what to do. There have been times I prayed and I said, God, this is what I want you to do. This is how I want you to do it. And God, this is when I want you to do it. Aren't you glad Jesus loves us even when we act like Marthas? He didn't go, even though he was called. He didn't go even though he was concerned. And he didn't go even though he was conscious of what went on. The messenger goes and Lazarus gets worse. And Jesus knows Lazarus is getting worse. The message comes to Jesus and Lazarus is worse and worse. And Lazarus' heart finally stops beating. And Jesus knows the exact moment. Jesus knows all about it, and he still waits 2 days. Now, don't miss this. It took a day for the messenger to get there. Jesus gets the message. He stays 2 more days, so that's 3 days. And Jesus is a day walk away. So by the time Jesus finally does do something, it's been 4 days. 4 days. Finally, Jesus does go. He tells the disciples, let's go wake Lazarus up. And the disciples are like, Jesus, what are you thinking? They warned to stone you last time you were there. Why are you going back? But he goes back. Why? Why did it take him so long? Why did Jesus wait? Mary and Martha are pacing the floor. Mary and Martha are wringing their hands. Mary and Martha are crying tears. And Jesus waits. Why? There are at least 3 reasons. At least 3 reasons why Jesus waits. The first one has to do with people. Now, I didn't know this, but I've done some research. In biblical times, when a person died, they were buried that day. When you died, they buried you right away. There was no, the family will be receiving friends this hour and then the funeral. No. They put you in the tomb very quickly. Now also, I want you to know this. It was a custom and it was a ritual. For 3 days, the only people that could go into the house were immediate family. Day 1, immediate family only. Day 2, immediate family only. Day 3, immediate family only. Day 4 was when the whole community finally came. Day 4 was when everyone was there. Now we are told in verse number 45 that once Jesus does raise Lazarus, that many of the Jews believed. Now if Jesus had went on day 1, many Jews wouldn't have been there. If Jesus had went on day 2, many Jews wouldn't have been there. If Jesus had even went on day 3, many Jews would not have been there. But he waited to day 4. And when he gets there, everybody in town is there. When he walks to that little house in Bethany that day, it's full. It's full of people who care. It's full of people who have heard about Jesus. Some believe about him, some don't. But everybody in town is there. That's one reason he waited. Here's another one. He gets there. Guess who greets him first? Martha. And don't you think for one moment she's not mad as she can be at him. I can hear as many meals as I cooked for him, he could have at least came to the funeral. I'm never cooking another thing. Here he comes in, brings these 12 big men, and I just whip up meals left and right. And when I'm hurting, he can't even come. You ever said something like that? You ever said, as much as I've done for you, Lord, and when I need you the most, you're not even there? So when he finally does get there, here she comes. Now the Bible doesn't say this, but you picture it. You know she had one hand on her hip and the other one she was pointing with. That's just how I picture the scene. Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Jesus, if. You know that little word if? That little word if causes us so much problems. If only I had not said that. If only I had said that. If only I had been there. If only I had quit smoking years before. If only, if, Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Well, Jesus can't do anything with Martha. I mean, what do you say to a woman who's that mad? I'll tell you what Jesus says. He says, somebody go get Mary. They go get Mary. And Mary's weeping. Mary is crying. And she comes out and she falls before Jesus. And she says the exact same words. If you had been here, Jesus, my brother wouldn't have died. What was the difference? Martha, I think, did it with a pointed finger. Mary did it on her knees before her Savior. Well, as soon as Mary begins to weep, Jesus says, show me the tomb. Now, there are 3 times in the Bible, 3 times in the Gospels, where Jesus raises the dead. The first account is Jairus and his daughter, young thing. And Jairus' daughter had been dead a matter of minutes, a matter of moments, when Jesus gets there and he raises her. The second account happens in a little town called Nain. A widow had just lost her son. We don't know how old he was, but I assume he was a little bit older than Jairus' daughter. Jairus' daughter had been dead a few moments, and Jesus raised her. Now, the widow of Nain's son, they were on the way to bury him. He had been dead a few hours. Now, Lazarus, he has been in the tomb 4 days. In fact, Martha's talking again. When Jesus says, show me the tomb, Martha says, but Lord, the King James Version says he stinketh. When you look in the Greek to find that word, what that word stinketh means, it means he smells. It means that the decaying process has begun. Now, I can hear the skeptics talking about Jairus' daughter. Oh, she wasn't really dead. It was just a few moments. She just passed out. They just thought she was dead. Oh, Jesus just helped her up. She was coming back anyway. She was coming to. Maybe he smacked her on the face a little bit and she came to and everything was all right. The widow of Nain's son, he'd been dead only a few hours. Oh, no, he wasn't really dead. He was just in a coma. Finally, he'd come out of that coma. Everything was okay. But Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. There was no doubt about it. He wasn't just asleep. He wasn't in a coma. He was dead. To prove it, the decaying process had begun, and I can only imagine what it smelled like when the tomb was opened. But I want you to know something else. It took the same amount of power to raise the little girl, Jairus' daughter. It took the same amount of power to raise the widow of Nain's son. It took the same amount of power that it took to raise Lazarus from the dead, who had been there 4 days. And the same thing happens with grace. It takes the same amount of grace for God to save somebody who's moral as it does for God to save someone who's not. It takes the same amount of grace for God to save a young child as it does for him to save someone who's old. 4 days Lazarus has been in the tomb. And Jesus says, show me the tomb. They open the tomb. And Jesus cries out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. Why did he say Lazarus? Because if he hadn't, every tomb in that place would have opened. Because if he hadn't specifically called out Lazarus' name, there wouldn't have been a dead person around. That's the type of power Jesus has. Everybody's there. He waited 4 days. He's showing his power. And here's the third reason. It had to do not only with people. 4 days, everybody's there. Not only to do with power, but it had a purpose. The Jews already didn't like him. The Jews they were still mad. Remember back in chapter 5, Jesus goes to the pool, and there's a man laying on a mat who's been there up in the 30s of years. And Jesus tells him to take up his mat and walk. And he does. Remember why that made them so mad? It was the Sabbath. They still have not gotten over that. They still are a little bit mad about that. And now Jesus has the audacity to call someone back to life who had been dead for 4 days. The Jews get together. They say, we got to stop this. We got to talk about this. If this fella keeps continuing doing this, we're going to lose our power. If this man keeps on acting like this, they're not going to come to our temple anymore. If this man doesn't stop raising the dead and doing things like this, we are going to lose everything we have worked for centuries. So verse 53 tells us, from that day on, what day? The day he raised Lazarus from the dead. They planned to put him to death. The raising of Lazarus to the Jews was the straw that broke the camel's back. They said, we have got to get rid of this man. We have got to do something. And Jesus uses the raising of Lazarus as a springboard to get to the cross. Now here's Mary and Martha, wringing their hands, crying their tears, wondering why God isn't showing up. But here was their problem. You know, I was late getting into the computer age. For someone my age at least. Some of you probably still don't have a computer. But for someone in their college years, I was really late. My first computer was a Packard Bell. Y'all remember that company? And I was in seminary when I got my first computer. And I remember, they said, oh, just get on there and you'll have no problems. Just get on there and play with it. You cannot break it, they said. They lied. I got a virus. That thing got a virus. It gave it to the refrigerator and the stove. Everyone in the house got sick. Took forever to get that thing straightened out. But one thing I like to do, find old hymnals and old psalm books that are out of print. And you can do that on eBay. And I remember I was looking up some old song books on eBay, and there they were, and I wanted to know what songs were in them. And I was squinting. I didn't have glasses then. I was squinting and I was trying. I think that song right there says such and such. And my roommate in seminary walked by and he said, well, why don't you blow it up? I said, well, I just got it fixed, so I don't want to blow the thing up. So then he done just a few little clicks. And that little picture of that songbook all of a sudden was all over the whole screen. And you know what? Once it was blown up, I could see things I could not see before. Mary and Martha are wringing their hands, wondering what in the world is going on. But they couldn't see the big picture. They couldn't see the big picture. They couldn't understand what Jesus was. They couldn't see everything. All they could see was their current circumstances. If you don't hear anything else I say today, hear this. Maybe you're hurting. Maybe you're going through circumstances and your heart is broken and you are crying tear after tear after tear and you don't know why. And you wonder why God hasn't done something. And you pray for that loved one and that loved one has not gotten better. And you pray that God would heal that marriage, but it's getting worse. And you pray that God would do something in your finances, but they're getting worse. You may not can see it now, but I promise you there is a purpose for it. And God says, I can take even the worst circumstances and I can make something great out of them. Paul would put it like this. In the book of Romans, the 8th chapter, the 28th verse, Paul would say, we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Now, what if Jesus had just showed up the first day? Said, okay, Lazarus, it looks like you got a little fever. Here, boom, you're better. We'd miss this story. We would miss this good thing. I love the song Andre Crouch wrote, Through It All. And there's a verse, I hadn't planned on singing it, but I believe I might as well sing it than to say it. Because one of his verses, the last verse goes like this. I thank God for the mountains, and I thank him for the valley. I thank him for the storms he brought me through. Now listen to this. Because if I never had a problem, wouldn't know that God could solve them. And I'd never know what faith that God could do. Through it all, I've learned to trust in Jesus. I've learned to trust in God. Through it all, I've learned to depend upon his word. You see, Mary and Martha, they wanted Jesus to do something about Lazarus' sickness here. But Jesus knew this. Jesus knew that he could heal Lazarus, and he could. He could have prevented Lazarus from dying, and he could have. But if he had done that, Lazarus would have got sick again, and Lazarus would have died again. What Jesus was doing, he was going to use this experience as a springboard to get him to the cross. And at the cross, he was going to deal with death once and for all. I thank God that he waited. You know, there's an old legend. It says Lazarus lived years after this event. That Lazarus turned to be an old man. But everywhere Lazarus went, he just couldn't stop talking about the fact that one day Jesus had resurrected him from the dead. I mean, wouldn't you want to talk about it? And then one day a cruel Roman emperor came on the throne, Caligula. You probably heard of him. And he called Lazarus in before him. And he said, Lazarus, you've got to stop talking about that. Lazarus, we've heard all of that we want to hear. Lazarus, hush. And Lazarus says, I can't do that. That experience was so great. That experience was so powerful. I have got to talk about it. And Caligula said, Lazarus, if you don't stop talking about it, I'm going to put you to death. And the legend says that Lazarus started to laugh. And Caligula said, what are you laughing about? Don't you realize I have the power to put you to death? And Lazarus looked up at him and said this, been there, done that, and I'm not scared. That's why Jesus waited. He waited so Lazarus could look Caligula in the face and say, I am not scared of death. And so can you. You can say the same thing. Because in this passage, Jesus says some of the greatest words he ever said. I am the resurrection. And I am life. And those who believe in me, even though they die, they will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. John 11, 25 and 26. And he closes. After he says, those who believe in me will never die, he says this. Do you believe this? What a question. Do you?